A couple of weeks ago, I went to a player development conference at Wake Forest University. And one of the biggest star-powered segments there was a panel with four very sharp pitching minds. Three pitching coaches, Caleb Cotham from the Phillies, Matt Blake from the Yankees, and Derek Johnson from the Reds, alongside the Astros director of pitching, Eric Neeson. When Caleb Cotham was asked about working with a staff that had both a lot of command and deep mixes, Wheeler, Nola, Suarez, Sanchez, etc., he responded with one of my favorite quotes of the weekend. Throw more pitches with simpler plans to make hitters account for different spots in the zone and be random. Now, there's a lot in that sentence. I could probably make a video on each phrase, but the first three words are what this video is about. Throw more pitches. Not literally throwing more pitches in a given outing, but expanding the depth of a pitcher's repertoire. I anticipate the league will create new incentives to help revalue the starting pitcher in the next, say, 5 years or so. I don't know if this is coming in the form of a double hook or banning the opener or 4 outs when a reliever enters a game, but I know something is coming. And when that happens, I have a theory that I think more teams will adopt. The probability of becoming a starting pitcher increases the earlier you're exposed to an expanded repertoire. So let's break it down. The average starting pitcher last year had 4.8 pitches. 7 starters threw 7 or more pitches, and just 8 starters threw 3 or less pitches. The deep mix guys, those 7+ pitch guys, are biased older, likely going towards bigger mixes to stave off velocity regression. So we have a bit of survivorship bias there. And the shallow mix starters have some unique traits that allow them to survive with a smaller mix, even though it's clear to me that a few of these guys should be throwing another pitch. I'm looking at you, Graham Ashcraft. Why aren't you throwing a curveball? But that's besides the point. Driveline Baseball took a stab at quantifying arsenal value through 2 terms, mix and match. Mix determines how expansive a repertoire is, giving value to bigger pitches like curveballs and sweepers. The idea being that we want you to cover more of this pitch plot with different offerings. Match is focused on bridging between pitches and filling in gaps. It gives more values to things like splitters, cutters, and changeups. You can combine these 2 variables and figure out the utility of pitches within a repertoire, including an overall arsenal score. One of the more interesting things found in this study was that higher mix pitches, so these bigger offerings that expand the coverage of repertoires, induce less swings on average. And for pitchers with more average stuff, these same big mix pitches induce less damage on contact. Match pitches kind of do the opposite. They generate more swings on average. And for those average stuff plus pitchers, they allow more damage. You can see how this approach kind of makes repertoire construction a puzzle. And per Driveline's logic, more is generally going to be better. And sure, there are a lot of pitchers that don't need repertoire depth and are just going to pound you in the zone with amazing stuff. I think of Hunter Green and Tanner Houck. But the majority of starters in MLB aren't those kinds of pitchers. And I think you can even argue that some of the best pitchers in baseball who have good stuff succeed or at least stave off league adjustments by expanding and adjusting. We've seen this every year with Cotham's guy, Zach Wheeler. He added a splitter last year and added a sweeper the year before. If you froze Wheeler's mix in 2021 or 2022, I'd argue anecdotally that he wouldn't be as productive as he is today. Hitters in the league are just too good at making adjustments. This allows me to get to a more specific version of my theory. I think especially if you don't have overpowering stuff, which I'll emphasize again is the majority of pitchers in baseball, you should be throwing at least 5 or 6 pitches, 3 or 4 to each handedness. And the primary reason is to take advantage of what Driveline is pointing out, these arsenal effects. Now, I mentioned earlier in that first theory that I really like the early exposure angle because I think the earlier exposed, the more feel you grow of that pitch as you ascend through the minor leagues. Now, this is a tougher one to objectify and really dig into research on, primarily because there isn't a lot of research on this. But I think the way we could kind of back into it perhaps is by looking at what major league organizations are doing on this very topic in the minor leagues. Among minor league pitchers with at least 5 starts, and I'm looking on a team basis here, so the 4 levels between Class A up to AAA, these are the leaders and stragglers in repertoire depth. The Astros, Diamondbacks, and Twins are in the top 3 at almost 4.5 different pitches per starter. and the Yankees, Braves, and Rays are in the bottom 3 with a full pitch less. We can adjust this list to exclude AAA as well, paying closer attention to early career depth that I was talking about. And while our numbers in order change ever so slightly, the rankings of the top 3 and the bottom 3 stay the same. The Twins and Astros are both top 10 in the minor leagues in the age of these pitchers we're sampling here, implying that maybe they're working with more polished starters or mature guys. Regardless, I would lean towards thinking both the Twins and the Astros specifically are being deliberate in their approach with deep mixes early in the minors. The Yankees and Rays, however, have been great pitching development organizations the last few years, and they don't seem to really care about depth of mix. The Rays specifically push velocity a ton, averaging the hardest sliders in the minor leagues and a really high zone rate. So if we were to categorize them, it's more put your best stuff in the zone, which looks a lot different than the Twins and the Astros, which are more throw a bunch of different pitches. We unfortunately do not have a perfect correlation here between the number of pitches an organization's minor league starters throw and the success of that organization from a results standpoint. If anything, there might be a negative correlation here where the smaller your repertoire is, the better your results are in the minor leagues. But that gets to a more philosophical question of, okay, are we actually looking for results in the minor leagues? Is that what leads to major league starting pitcher success, which is essentially the end goal for any of these organizations? Because the primary way to get success in the minors is probably to throw hard, which maybe is indicative of starting pitcher success in the majors, but it's also just to spam sliders, which a lot of organizations do overall. So again, this is a tough topic to tackle and really dig into and prove one side or the other. My preference is just to lean towards this early exposure, deep mix standpoint, because my goal, if I was running an organization, would be to create major league starting pitchers. We've seen the market value those guys incredibly high. And I think that stands for something overall. And we at least see a couple organizations here that agree. But again, I know you've gotten to this point in the video, you probably have counters, and I'm probably going to guess some of those counters right here and maybe even rebuttal them a bit. So let's dig in. The first counter is probably the most obviously supported by hard numbers. Just throw your best pitch as much as possible. This has led to the current state we're in right now, where some orgs succeed by using relievers to cover a higher percentage of their team's total innings, allowing them less need to mix and match their repertoires for the purposes of success. But the life of a starting pitcher is much different. If there's an incentive to have a starter go deeper into a game, then things like decay and buyback come into play, both topics that I've touched on before that counter the idea that a starter specifically can just throw their best pitch a bunch and succeed. The main driver of that third time through the order penalty is connected to pitch familiarity, how often you see a pitch, not something like fatigue. And in order to counter the decay or regression of your best pitch in an outing as you turn over lineups and hitters see it more, well, depth of repertoire, mixing and matching to steal drivelines metrics, again, I think are necessary. An aggressive counter I heard from a tough luck coach, let's call him, was that if you're worried about doming a guy up because you're giving him a bunch of pitches in Class A or High A, then you're probably not worried about that guy becoming a stud long-term on your team. And make of that what you will. He's basically saying that the risk of loss there is low if you're worried about a guy's psyche at that low level. I guess my angle is maybe on this psychological bent is that I think perhaps there's adaptation that comes, right? You look at some strength and performance curves over time, pretty basic stuff in terms of how you grow and increase skill. There's obviously probably some drop initially when you're overexposed to something. So even if that drop occurs initially, I'm basically betting long-term that that pitcher who maybe got it domed up initially, learning 3 new pitches, over time becomes a better version of himself. So again, the psychological element is fascinating. I'd be curious to hear an actual sports psychologist's idea on this and whether he agrees with the stimulus point and overexposure, but I don't know. It's another one of those things that is not particularly objective for us to dig into, but is really fun to think about. The last counter we're going to touch on here creates a standoff with an earlier point I had about early exposure increasing feel. And it's the idea that a lot of pitches that you need to expand a repertoire are pretty easy to add late in a guy's career. This is probably the one that I'm guessing teams like Tampa agrees with. Cutters can be taught in one bullpen session, most likely. Sinkers are taught consistently now through seam effects and seam shifted wake, so there really isn't too much of a dramatically different cue than just throw this really hard like you would your four seam. This is probably the most legitimate counter, with the only rebuttal, again, connected to what I just said, our theory here that there's some long-term advantage to being exposed to the pitch earlier in your career and giving you time to develop command with it. It feels to me like this topic is always going to exist in this debate land where there's going to be two sides to the story, and based on your experience as a coach or someone thinking about the game, you probably lean one direction or the other. But I will say, in talking to a variety of people about this, old school and new school, there was a lot of consensus and aggression in saying that I want my guys throwing more pitches earlier in their career. And I think that is perhaps connected to seeing a lot of success at the major league level of really good starting pitchers and just wanting to emulate that. I know on my last video, we talked about velocity and how it's kind of taking over the amateur circuit. Well, that's a representation of what's happening at the major league level. Guys are throwing really hard. So you're going to kind of go towards what you see as an example. And if we have pitchers like Paul Skeens and Zach Wheeler and Logan Gilbert, et cetera, all these guys throwing 6 pitches and adding things year over year, I think that's going to make a lot of guys a lot more interested in adding pitches earlier in their career. And perhaps naturally, the league will become more starting pitcher friendly, or you'll have more willingness to push a guy deep into the game because of the depth of his particular mix. But I'm curious on your thoughts on this overall, just because if you listen to this whole video and got to this point, again, then there's probably some opinions that you have, and I want to hear them. So I'll be in the comments. As always, thank you for watching.